As we head into the year 2024 and the 80th anniversary of World War II and start to plan for Memorial Day, I would like to offer you a story that is one of the great American stories in history. And it's about my grandfather's family from Crab Orchard, Tennessee, and from Nashville, Tennessee, named the Donelsons. There are a great number of historians who have written books and talked about my family. And a lot of times people get mesmerized, as I do and everyone else, with President Andrew Jackson, who married Rachel Donelson. But I'd like to take you back to the migration of the Donelsons from what they call prehistory Dublin, Ireland. And what they did was they settled in Franklin County, Virginia. And John Donelson became part of the legislation in Virginia from 1770 to 1779. He was part of what they call the House of Burgesses, which was the lawmakers, basically, of Virginia. And he created Washington Iron Furnace, which was one of the first employers in Virginia. And it was a very successful business adventure for him. He left and moved to the Watauga River and began to explore and pioneer throughout North Carolina. And in 1780, ended up in what they called Fort Nashboro, Tennessee. And he renamed it Nashville, Tennessee, and was proud to have founded one of the first towns in Tennessee. His son, Stockley Donelson, founded Crab Orchard, Tennessee. And as they moved about, there were diaries that they keep in Cleveland Hall down in the Hermitage, Tennessee area. Rachel Stockley was John Donelson's wife, and she had 11 children altogether. And she lived from 1730 until 1801. The most prolific of all the children was Rachel Jackson. And then you can go on down through the children to Stockley Donelson, which is my grandfather's side of the Donelsons, the ones that came from Crab Orchard, Tennessee. Stockley Donelson's father, John, was shot and killed in 1785, and the state of Tennessee honored him by dedicating a town that's now called Donelson, Tennessee, to him and my family's efforts in the beginning of Tennessee through the pioneering years of the 1700s. John Donelson was Scottish, and his family came from Dublin, Ireland, settling in Canada for a period of time, and then moving down to Franklin County, Virginia, to Fort Nashboro in 1780. John and Rachel had a daughter named Rachel Jackson, and she was born in 1828, and in 1787 married Louis Robards from Kentucky. And she lived there for a period of time and began to feel unhappy, probably because she had always been on the move. She had been in a large family, and she was now secluded with Mr. Roberts in Kentucky. And they decided to bring their marriage to conclusion. And she left, and she went back to Fort Nashboro with her father and the rest of her family, and met Andrew Jackson, which began one of the great love stories in Tennessee history. In 1796, Stockley Donelson founded Crab Orchard, Tennessee, and he had 4 children. Their names were Samuel, Jennifer, Thomas, and Robert Donelson. And of course, they populated the Tennessee area there and were able to bring forth a mineral deposit there in Crab Orchard, Tennessee, that became something that could sustain the town financially. And so, as they began to populate and began to have settlers move into the area, people began to realize some of the potential in the state of Tennessee as far as creating commerce, as far as creating governments and settling towns. And they were right there in the beginning of it with Nashville and Crab Orchard, Tennessee. In 1821, Andrew Jackson began to build the Hermitage, and of course that was after his return from the Great War of 1812, which a lot of people credited him for concluding that war. And he did some amazing things down there, one of which is as the English brought the Navy in sort of the last part of that war, he was severely outmanned. And he went around on the shorelines and built campfires. And there were more campfires than were needed by far, but it created the illusion to the English Navy that there were more troops than what there were, and helped them to reach a decision to move out and create a different plan of attack, which he was critical in stopping as well. In 1856, Andrew Jackson Jr. sold the Hermitage, and when he did, the state of Tennessee bought it. But the Hermitage was home to the Jackson Donelson family for quite some time, just as the White House was home to them for 8 years. During their campaigns after New Orleans, Andrew Jackson took his Tennessee militia and went down to, I guess what you would call, incept the state of Florida from all of the chaos and anarchy that was going on. The president called, and I believe it was President Monroe, that called Andrew Jackson and asked him if he would be able to lead troops down into the area, because there was a lot of Spanish explorers who were down there. They were recruiting. There was also some issues with slaves running away and joining into these groups of Indians and Spanish explorers, conquistadors, and such. And they were all planning attacks against the settlers. So the president wanted him to go down there and see if there was some way to build a bridge between the Spanish explorers, the Indians, the runaway slaves, back into the United States, and eventually have them join and be accepted as one of the southern states in the United States of America, which he did, and he did it in his unorthodox style. When he first left out, he had quite a band of soldiers that he had put together that comprised of slaves. There was also Native Americans. There were, landowners. There were all kinds of different soldiers in that Tennessee militia. And they had an issue with 3 of them wanting to get out of the Army, and I guess what you would call one of the first attempts at AWOL. And the three soldiers had packed their stuff up and they were leaving. And General Jackson shot and killed those three soldiers. And so there was no doubt in anyone's mind who the leader was of this militia. And it was General Jackson. There was no way to hide the fact that General Jackson was a brutal man. He really was. But he was a leader that was forged in the Revolutionary War from his time in South Carolina, where the English soldiers had taken he and his brother. They had killed his father, and his mother had died while he was a POW in the Revolutionary War at the age of 13. He was treated terribly, as his brother was, and while his brother was dying of smallpox, he was beaten severely for refusing to shine the boots of an English, I guess you would call them English commander, who beat him with a sword, leaving him scarred for life, not only physically, but mentally, I'm sure. And there was time there between the time he was 13 until he was in his 20s that we don't really have much account for, that I'm sure were some very suffering years for a young man with the soldiers in the Revolution, learning how to become who he became. So there are some, not excuses, but there are some extenuating circumstances that helped to forge his brutality. And once he got into the state of Florida, I think everybody knew who General Jackson was, which sort of helped things along quite a bit. He did stop and find one of the groups of Englishmen supplying guns to what he considered to be the enemy of the United States in the Indians, the runaway slaves, and the Spanish settlers, and arrested them. And there were 4 of them, I believe. And he took them into custody, and they went before a judge. And the judge sentenced 3 of them to death for treason. And they took them out. They hung them. And General Jackson gathered his troops and began to leave to seek other conflicts to bring to resolution. And as he did, someone got word to him that when the King of England sent word to the President, President Monroe sent word to the judge, and they were going to release Mr. Armbruster because he was basically a diplomat for the king and one of his very good friends. And Andrew Jackson decided to do something that I believe changed American history. And I always look at it as when the umbilical cord from the English dictatorship or a parliament was cut, and American democracy became its own entity. Because he went back and overrode the judge as a general and walked Mr. Armbruster out, tied him to a tree, and they shot him and killed him. And the King of England decided that he was going to go to war with the United States over the ordeal, and began to have his army and navy load up the boats. And the president was outraged at General Jackson for committing such an atrocious act when he had been told to do differently. The judge in the situation was powerless because General Jackson had that kind of influence. And plus, he had a large-scale military with him. So the judge had to do what General Jackson said, or obviously General Jackson would have killed him. And so everyone in the country was aware that the English were going to come back and go to war. But General Jackson simply went on about his business, following out his orders through the state of Florida. There are accounts of a great war chief, an Indian, who came to one of the soldiers' camps. And some of the soldiers said that they wept because he showed up in war paint and full Indian headdress and walked through the camp, through the middle of the road against his enemy, and went straight to Jackson's tent. And as he did, they said that you could hear the soldiers crying. And the Indian war chief looked the general in the eye, and he said, "I am here to surrender on behalf of my people." And General Jackson looked up at him, and he said, "I admire your valor and your courage, and I ask that you take your people and find a place to repopulate. But understand, this is America." And the Indian war chief left and took his people to the rivers with a new understanding of American government. And you can imagine how he felt, because his people were almost extinct due to Jackson's will and his brutality. And those are the kind of stories that helped Jackson through the rest of the campaigns in Florida, because a lot of times him showing up with his troops alone was enough for them to submit. They said that when he got to the southern peninsula, he began to have warships built to go out to Cuba through the Keys, settling it. And the President of the United States had to stop him. And that is the kind of general that Andrew Jackson was. A man who had been through war his entire life and found some peace in Tennessee in his wife, Rachel Donelson. And the state of Florida asked him to be their representative to the President of the United States, just as Tennessee had asked him to be the senator, if you will, for the state of Tennessee. And he acted in the same manner as the military commander who took over the state of Florida. He was considered to be the first mayor, or first senator, first representative of that state as well. And when he came back, he went to Hermitage, Tennessee, and of course told the Donelsons the stories of his military campaign. And Rachel was elated to see that her husband had returned after all these years again. And he told her that his commanding officers and the voters in Tennessee and Florida had developed their own idealisms about how this country should be run. And they were forming a new party to combat the Whigs, the Republicans, and the other belief systems that were heading for leadership positions in Washington. And they were going to be the Democratic Party. And so he was the representative and the founding father of the Democratic Party, one of the longest tenured parties in United States government's history. And she was overwhelmed. And some believe that she was sick at the time already. And the news of all of the responsibilities uh, being taken over in this country by General Jackson, her husband, uh, really weighed on her, and her sickness got to be worse. And she died in the Hermitage House less than a year before he was to take office in Washington, D.C. And she left word and had conversations with Andrew Jackson Donelson and his wife, also his first cousin, Emily Donelson. And they were going to be the counsel that General Jackson needed as he created this new America and transitioned us from the Revolutionary War, really, uh, to the beginnings of the Civil War, which were the final stitches in this country's quest for democracy. And a lot of the commerce issues, the banking issues, the tax issues, and all of these in-house governing and legislative programs were instituted by that Jackson-Donelson presidency. And when they got to Washington, D.C., after Rachel's death, there was a year of mourning because President Jackson loved Rachel and loved the Donelson family so much for creating peace in his life after being a orphan soldier all those years and helping him to understand family, and then to have lost the love of his life during the greatest accomplishment period of his life really took a toll on him and the Donelson family. But it brought them closer together, and they were able to accomplish some great things in Washington as the first true Irish American representatives. They were able to seat 3 first ladies in history, and that was under the Jackson presidency that 3 Donelson women served as first ladies. Of course, Emily took over for Rachel, who never made it to Washington, but is recognized as one of the first ladies of Andrew Jackson. Emily Donelson served, I believe it was 6 years of Jackson's presidency. And then her role was taken over by, I think it was her cousin, Sarah Yorkey Donelson, and finished out that presidency for Andrew Jackson, who many consider to be the first Irish Americans in government in the United States. Once their time in Washington concluded, a lot of people thought it was a great presidency because there was someone very special who came from Washington, D.C. back to Tennessee, and her name was Mary Donelson. And that is the namesake of my mother, Mary Donelson, which always kind of makes me smile. But she was the first child born in the White House. And those were some special times for the Donelson family. If you ever get a chance, I'll post an account from Mary Donelson of the first Christmases in the White House. And they were readings that she did as she looked over some of the memoirs from the Jackson presidency. When they got back to Tennessee, there were 8 years where Andrew Jackson was able to find some peace and just stay inside of the Tennessee legislation. And Andrew Jackson Donelson went on to do some great things in government, and was even asked by President Tyler to be vice president, and then was asked to help Governor Sam Houston with some legislation in Texas, as Texas was incepted as one of our southern states. And they began to have the southern and northern issues, which led to military campaigns for Colonel Donelson, where he lost two sons in the Civil War. And you can go to Tennessee in Nashville and Crab Orchard and other towns and see some of the Donelson cemeteries and some of the old soldiers from the Revolution, some of the soldiers from the Civil War. And you can stop in to any of the history museums, and you'll find a lot of artifacts and a lot of stories about the Donelsons and Andrew Jackson. But I think that one of the great stories from my Donelson family came to us through my grandpa and grandma, as in 1944 they received a letter from a soldier over in Europe. And in the letter, he talks a lot about his insight to the war. And I found out later that Private Roy E. Smith passed away on May the 12th, 1944. And it does look like the letters marked May the 2nd, 1944, or May the 5th. It's hard to read. But one of his last letters was to my grandpa, James Donelson. And it reads like this. Well, Jack, thought I would write you a few lines tonight while laying around in my pup tent, trying to pass away the time, because one day seems like a week over here. No place to go, nothing to do. Well, Jack, things with you pretty good, I hope. How are you standing with the draft board now? From what I can hear, they're about to quit drafting anybody anymore. Say, Jack, how's your baby and wife? Fine, I hope. I guess it's walking by now, your baby. Well, I sure would like to be back around there for a while. This damn country here, they can take it, give it to the Indians for all I care. If I had a farm here and a home in hell, I'd sell my farm and go home. That's how well I like it. I don't think there was ever anything here but sour water and alcohol, which will kill you and make you blind. Well, I'll close up for tonight. It's getting bedtime. Just any place on the ground, that's my bed. See you soon. A friend, Roy E. Smith. P.S. I don't guess you can read this letter. The markings on it are ACM 2488 3333. It's from Private Roy E. Smith, Casual Company, 337 Infantry, APO 85, care of Postmaster, New York, and like I said, it looks like 5244. Paid by Examiner 28.